Hello, everyone. This is Vito Quaglia, and whether or not you know it, it's a matter of principle that I talked to John Gaffney today. Just so you're all aware, somewhere out there in, I guess, the atmosphere, the internets, as the old folks say, there is a copy, a recording of a podcast interview that John and I had done a while back, and it got lost due to technical difficulties, so had to make sure that we got Mr. Gaffney back here with us. Now, John is a friend of mine from way back, from back in the days of high school at Bishop Hoban High School back in the day, and he's someone who I consider a musical expert in a lot of ways, a musician himself, a former music teacher, has played in different bands throughout, probably a 30 or 40-year career, also is a music podcast and social media expert, as well as two podcasts he's affiliated with, ACDC and Black Sabbath are the topics there. He has a YouTube channel called The Lair of the Alchemist, where he has a whole bunch of different themed episodes, which is really worthwhile in watching and listening to that. So I'm going to let John tell you a little bit more about himself, but welcome to the podcast, Mr. Gaffney.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad it's too bad we lost that first episode, but I enjoyed it so much that I have no problem revisiting this again and talking with you again. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. Like you mentioned, I've taught music in schools for 20 some years, active musician playing in everything from orchestras to rock bands. Now I spend time with my podcasts. I have an ACDC podcast called Kicked in the Teeth, an ACDC podcast that I do with a renowned heavy metal and hard rock author, Martin Popoff. And I have a Black Sabbath podcast that I do with my good friend, Darren, called Into the Void Black Sabbath podcast. And as you mentioned, I also have my YouTube channel that I started back in May of 2020, and it's called Lair of the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock.
Well, and it's really cool stuff. I've listened to some of the podcasts. I've watched, the YouTube channel. And again, you kind of, there's specific things that if you tune in just looking at those titles, you'd be like, all right, he's going to talk about these kind of things. But then whether you're doing it with your partners in the podcast or by yourself, you veer off into some really cool different themes. And it's really, you can go down a wormhole of watching and listening to what you're saying and then taking some of the tidbits of resources and things that you guys reference and then go off into, research world out there. So there's a lot of really cool content there. Now, the episode that we had done before that we lost, we were talking about 1984, which would have been our freshman year in high school, but we decided to, when we kicked it back off, we're going to focus on 1988, which would have been the year we graduated high school. I don't know if we were any more mature within those 4 years or not, but who knows? But in doing the little research into 1988, there was a lot of things that kind of popped out to me about just songs and albums that really I didn't realize were, connected to 1988 things, some things that were, one-hit wonders and gone, and other things that have really stood the test of time. So I'm anxious to see where this conversation goes. So I'm going to kind of let you lead this off. And where do you want to go? 1988 is the year in music we're going to talk about, and you start us off, my friend.
Sure. Yeah. 1988. It's, you mentioned it doesn't, sitting here at our age now, I won't mention our age, but sitting here at our age now, you look back and you think, and especially because you've taught and worked in high schools, I've been around high school kids also. The difference between a freshman and a senior when you're in school seems like such a world of difference. You come into high school as a freshman and the kids who are seniors seem so much older and so much more mature than you are. And of course, now sitting here at our age, and you realize that it's not really that much of a difference of time. 4 years isn't that much time. But back then, that was a lot of time, and a lot of things happen to you. You think about your first year of high school, you come in, it's this new chapter in your life. You're taking this sort of step towards more responsibility, taking more things in on your own. You're meeting a whole new group of people. The way it worked for us, both you and I went to a Catholic high school, and our Catholic high school was sort of fed into by various schools all around the area. So kind of came in with your small group of friends from your elementary school, but then you were meeting all these new people. And so our senior year it's sort of it's sort of the same thing. We're getting ready to start this new chapter in our lives. We're starting to think ahead to our future. If you remember your senior year, you're thinking about where you're going to go to college, what you might want to pursue for a career and stuff like that. So I view it as a transitional phase in my life, as was going into high school, leaving high school, our last year, sort of the same thing. So it's sort of interesting that for me, when you talk about music, I also think it was musically a year that I was starting to transition and move into different things. On my YouTube channel and on the podcast, I often refer to right about 1989 to basically my years in college. I refer to them as my years away from heavy metal, because I started to drift away from metal when I graduated from high school, and even sort of towards the end of our senior year. And part of that was I had been listening to hard rock and heavy metal from 1980 to 1988, and that's the only stuff that I listened to. And I like to use the guy that I do the ACDC podcast with. He likes to refer to it as the low information age, meaning the era before the internet. So we didn't have everything at our fingertips the way kids might now. So what I was listening to back then was a pretty narrow spectrum of music. I had my Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Dio, Ozzy. I had the classic rock stuff I like the Beatles, the Stones, the Doors, Hendrix, and stuff like that. But by 1988, I was starting to get a little bit tired of some of the heavy metal stuff that I was listening to. As I like to say, my favorite bands weren't putting out my favorite albums. For instance, ACDC releases Blow Up Your Video in 1988. And not an album that I hate, but it's not my favorite ACDC album by a long shot. Iron Maiden releases Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. I had sort of started to lose interest in Iron Maiden at that point. Judas Priest releases Ram It Down, which is an album that I had never cared for. So I started drifting away from Judas Priest, and heavy metal in general is starting to move in a more aggressive direction with thrash metal. Slayer releases South of Heaven in 1988. Metallica releases Injustice for All. And you're also starting to get just a general shift in music. You mentioned earlier, I can't remember if this was before we started the podcast, where you had mentioned Public Enemy. Public Enemy releases It Takes a Nation of Millions and starts moving rap music into the more gangster rap direction, a little more aggressive, slightly more darker, more intense. So there's just a lot of things changing. The whole LA glam hair metal sound of Poison and groups like that, that's starting to phase out. It's starting to become a little bit oversaturated. It's starting to become a little bit tiresome. MTV is starting to begin to change their format. I think before we started the podcast, you mentioned Soundgarden. Soundgarden releases, I don't know if it was their first record or their first EP, but so the whole Seattle scene is now starting to bubble, and it would, of course, bubble over in 91, 92 when Nirvana came out. So 1988 is an interesting year for music because I think there's a lot of things shifting and changing in 1988. And it was also an interesting year for my life personally. I would imagine for yours also, because our lives were shifting and starting to change, and we were starting to look forward into new, different horizons coming up for us. And I think music was sort of doing the same thing. It was starting to shift and change.
Yeah, and it's almost like there are these, I don't know, tectonic shifts or something in the whole, the globe of the world of music, because you mentioned the hair band, the glam metal stuff that was kind of, waning, because you had, Guns N' Roses just in 88 comes out, or in 87, you have Appetite for Destruction kind of puts shockwaves into all that and pushes back on all that stuff and says, let's get more stripped down into like hard rock kind of stuff. And then they come out with their sophomore album, GNR Lies. Then you have the ballad Patience, which kind of goes, all right, now we're going to have a ballad as well. And then you still had, I think in 88, if I'm right, I think you had Whitesnake, I think they had Is This Love? I think that was like, so
Yeah.
you had these, you still had this leftover hairband kind of ballady stuff going on. At the same time, you had, newer things that, and again, not things that at the time we weren't into, but if you look at the staying power and the pop culture references, like New Kids on the Block, they're Hangin' Tough comes out then. Bobby Brown comes out with his big solo thing, and, he had talk about somebody who was at the top and, falls apart and everything else with his life. But, he was huge at that time. You mentioned, Public Enemy. You also had, NWA at the same time. And then you talk NWA. And now there's a band that scared the living hell out of, America, conservative America, and, really pushed that whole gangster rap stuff. And then from that group comes, probably a family actor now, an Ice Cube. He's moved on to being an actor and even having family comedies, things like that. You have Dr. Dre, who's an icon with everything he's done, whether as a producer or, beats, headphones, things like that. So there's still people around that really 88 was like a launching pad for them, and really in 88, I think REM comes out with Green, which was their first, I think their album that was more political than they had been before, and trying to have a lot more, into what they saying about what was happening at that time. So a lot of crazy stuff in all different directions. And if you look at it, that was almost like one of the last times where you had so many, it wasn't like one thing was like rap in its own little thing was really big, and pop was really big, and metal was still kind of really big. So there was enough. There was enough room for everybody at the end of the 80s. If you liked music, you could find a camp to kind of park yourself into. But the thing I want to ask you about is, why do you think at that time, so all these new things, all these debuts, right? Like whether it's, I think Melissa Etheridge, that's her debut album. Like I said, some of these rap things, this is new, that's new. Guns N' Roses is still kind of a young band, at least to the public. And then the Traveling Wilburys come out with Volume 1, and you have all these really rock and roll dinosaurs getting together in this kind of middle-aged supergroup. Why do you think that resonated? Why would the Traveling Wilburys resonate at a time like that?
Wilburys and sort of the classic, that type of thing, that sort of classic music.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, because when you think about it, we enter high school in 1984. The Beatles release Let It Be in 1970.
Yeah.
The Beatles release, so 1970 to 1984 is only 14 years.
Yep.
So we're in 2024. That's like saying 2010, going back to 2010, which doesn't seem that far away when you're sitting here right now and thinking about it. So really not that much time had passed from the late 60s to early 70s with all these classic acts. And you got to think about it too. Okay, in 1984 or 1988, let's say 1988, I'm 18. My dad is roughly 38, 39, something like that. My dad's like just like most adults, by the time you're in your late 30s, your kids are starting to grow up and everything. You're settled into your career, and you start getting nostalgic for your high school days, looking back and remembering all this stuff. So I think that music, like when we were in high school, I always say this to people, and I don't know if this was a product of the area that we grew up in or the time frame that we grew up in. I have a feeling that it's a combination of both. But even though I was in school and the whole like MTV, Quiet Riot, Rat, Dawkins, Motley Crue, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, all that stuff, and MTV and all that stuff is going on, there was still a lot of interest in people really into the late 60s, early 70s stuff like the Doors, Hendrix, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and stuff like that. And again, I don't know if it was sort of a time frame thing. Usually styles of music, they're very popular. They go away for 10, 12 years, and then they come back into fashion. And they usually come back in when that generation has reached sort of their mid 30s, their late 30s, where they start looking back and remembering the music of their youth. when they were in high school. I really think that the music somewhere, so I know I read this somewhere in a study, and I don't know if this was an analytical study that somebody did or if they were just hypothesizing, that the music that you listen to you're in high school is the music that sticks with you for the rest of your life. And I believe that, because where I live right now, we live outside of this retirement city in Florida, and it's 150,000 plus retired people. And you'll see, I can almost tell when somebody graduated high school just by the way they dress, by the music that they listen to. You'll see guys that look like Elvis. They drive around in their muscle cars, their classic cars. The music that they're blasting out of their car is, the 60s or whatever. And so I think that everybody sort of has these memories and this fondness for the music of their high school years. And plus, enough time had passed from that classic music that by the late 80s, you're starting to see all these artists name drop those bands as an influence, name dropping the Beatles or the Stones or the Doors. And so it was sort of cool to like that stuff. Whereas probably by the late 70s, bands are trying to distance themselves from what came immediately before them and establish their own thing. So they're trying to be different than the Beatles and the Stones and Hendrix and all that kind of stuff. So the bands of the 70s were trying to do their own thing. Whereas I think by the late 80s, there was sort of this, like you said, there was so much music going on and so many things coming from so many different directions that you're getting all of these influences. Like I'm looking at a top 100 list of the 80s, George Michael, Faith, very like almost rhythm and blues, like very 70s blue-eyed soul. Guns N' Roses doing what sounds like a heavier version of Aerosmith. You have the pop stuff. You mentioned like Whitney Houston, and they're put a Cheap Trick, some bands left over from the 70s that are still doing things. So you have all this different kind of stuff that's going on. I remember Terrence Trent D'Arby of Wishing Well.
Yeah.
Very Hendrix, like very 70s, very. So yeah, it was sort of an interesting time. And I think it was just because enough time had passed from the late 60s and early 70s that sound could come back, and it didn't sound stale. It sounded fresh because there's a whole new generation of kids like we were 1988 where this sound and this stuff sounds fresh to us. Whereas if you were in high school in the late 60s, maybe you were sort of burnt out on that stuff because that's all you listened to during that time. Just like I mentioned earlier in the introduction there, that I had started to get burnt out on heavy metal and hard rock towards the end of the 80s because that's all I was listening to. So I needed some time away from that, and I needed to distance myself from it. And I think the grunge movement is a reaction to that, is a reaction to the hair metal, to the Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, to the world. Grunge comes out and doesn't cite any influence from that stuff, at least not openly. There's sort of a reaction against it. I think that's the way music always moves. It's always sort of each generation has their own sound, and each subsequent era of music is a reaction to the era that came before that. And every generation wants a music that's their own, that's going to upset their parents. You mentioned NWA, upsetting the moral majority. Well, that's what kids want. Kids want music that's theirs, that scares and upsets their parents. And hey, there was a point in time, I love A Bronx Tale, that movie, A Bronx Tale. There's a scene where the kid is like listening to jazz and the dad's like, turn that racket off,
Yep.
It's like, because, there was a point in time where big band jazz is what pissed off. Things.
it is. It's just this phenomenon that every time something's going in one direction, something eventually pushes back against it, whatever it is culturally. And what makes 88 and in and around 88, I'm sure it's, a little before, a little after, it's like that musical gumbo, because there's so much all mixed in. It's not really distilled in any one direction, because you have, the cool thing about, I don't know the song exactly, but I know the lyric song by Public Enemy where he references and says, Don't Worry, Be Happy was a #1 jam, and like slap me in the face if I say that kind of thing. Like, so he's pushing back at that little poppy happy song that was coming out at the same time, and they're pushing back on that, saying there's more important stuff to talk about. So that was happening in and around the same time. And then you have the whole, and while you have that kind of stuff and, the middle finger to whoever the man is at the time, then you have the influence that the movies had at that time, whether just coming off, the big Top Gun-y stuff in the early, mid 80s. Dirty Dancing was 87, 88. So you had a couple, 2, 3 songs there that were off that soundtrack. Patrick Swayze had a song that was like, who would ever reference Patrick Swayze as a singer, but he has that song from that movie in that same year. And then what happens too, like you were talking about, when it sounds almost like when a band establishes themselves a little bit, they have the freedom, or at least the cachet, because they sold some records, to reach back and say, well, I can cover this song and these guys might have influenced me, and I could do it now because I'm out here now. Like the Bangles, I think it was the Less Than Zero soundtrack. They do Hazy Shade of a Winter. And then, so there's, and U2, and Rattle and Hum, they do the song with B.B. King, and they have the Angel Heart. So they're reaching back to people that came before them, but they wouldn't be doing that, on the Boy album, you know what I mean, years ago when they're trying to establish themselves. So it's almost like once you've arrived, you can then kind of have these like little adventurous homages to the people who came before. And there was a whole lot of that in and around 88 in just the position of all these brand new bands, and then you had the pop stuff you talked about, like the Bon Jovi, Bad Medicine was, that you couldn't get more. That was everywhere. Where I think there was probably a Bon Jovi song that played at our prom, but you couldn't go anywhere without hearing that stuff. So yeah, that kind of everything at once happening at that time when you look back on it, you're like, holy cow, I didn't realize all this stuff was on the airwaves at that time. And people were out buying albums and cassette tapes, right? It wasn't digital. Like you couldn't just press a button and get all this stuff. You had to go somewhere, stand in line at Joe Nardone's or wherever and buy this stuff too. So that part of somebody had to actually leave their house and spend money, physically reach into a wallet and buy things. So, and again, kids listening to this, if there's anyone listening who's, 14, 15, 16, they have no concept of what that stuff's like.
Yeah. And it's when you think it's the 80s are coming to a close. The window is starting to close on the 80s, and you're moving into a new decade, and the 80s are known for being sort of over the top and bombastic and a lot. I think, what was that television show, Dallas? I think, affluent people spending money, this whole idea of like Wall Street and stuff like that. And that reflected in the music, like the hair metal bands partying like there's no tomorrow. The music is big, it's bombastic, everything on their stage shows are gigantic. Well, as the 80s start to come to a close, maybe everything's not all right, underneath the surface. And that's where, grunge is going to come around and remind everybody that, this materialism and this sort of way of living and partying like there's no tomorrow, or Public Enemy and groups like that, sort of making people aware of what's really going on out there in the world, not what you're seeing on MTV or on Dallas or some, TV show. So yes, there's a lot of stuff going on. And when you think about it, we're only 1988 I didn't get on the internet. I was very late getting on the internet. I didn't get on the internet till 1996, but the internet is right around the corner. We're only 3, 4, 5 years away from the internet, 5, 6 years away from everybody being on the internet. We're only 5 or 6 years away from cell phones starting to become a thing. Just everything is going to start changing, in the early 90s, and the 90s is going to be a much different decade than the 80s were. So yeah, and I think for most styles of music, you get maybe 3 to 4 years of real creativity happening, and then you just get the copycat.
Yep.
And with the LA glam metal thing, the first wave of it is interesting. The Motley Crues, the Rats and the Dawkins and the Quiet Riots and stuff like that. And then you just get 1,000 bands after them that are trying to sound like that. The same thing with grunge. The first wave of grunge would be very interesting with Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Alice in Chains. And then there would be a million bands imitating them. And by the time we got to the late 90s, everybody's think of it, 1998 is not really, doesn't feel too much different than 1988 in the musical sense that people are sort of getting tired of, what came before it. And when you think back to these groups from the 60s and the 70s, they didn't have super, super long careers. They had maybe five. I mean, Hendrix was only when his first album came out, and he was dead like 3 or 4 years later.
Yeah.
The Doors, I don't remember when the first Doors record came out, 66 or something, and Jim Morrison's dead, 71 or something like that,
Exactly.
early 70s he dies. So they have like a 5-6 year, it seems much longer because we look back and they have all these records and you think that like, oh, they had these super, super long careers, but they didn't. Black Sabbath with Ozzy, 1970 to 1978. Led Zeppelin, I think the first Led Zeppelin album came out in 68, I think, and they're done by like 78. Bonham dies in 80, I think it is, 79, 80. They were one of the bands that have a longer career for groups back then. So it's kind of the Beatles. I mean, my gosh, the Beatles, I don't remember what their first year was, their first album, but it was something like 65 or 66, and they're done by 1970. How much stuff they put out in like 5 or 6 years. It's sort of incredible when you think about it.
Well, and the stuff that it's almost that at that, you reference those 60s, that era, bands are putting out 2-3 records a year, and they're churning things out, where now somebody puts something together and you have to wait 3 or 4 years for the next thing. And by that time, the culture has shifted in different ways. So it's almost like they can't really stay ahead of the curve because they're waiting so much, longer in between things. And when you look at some of the songs from 88, it's almost like, like one of those pans when you would, the old gold, when you're trying to mine gold and you kind of shake it until the gold stays there, because some of the, like, you can look at it and it was all this, there's a lot of disposable music, right? It was like, oh, it was cool at the time and no one remembers any of it. But then whether, like, I know last year there, Tracy Chapman was playing on the award show with, a country artist right now covering Fast Car, so that comes out in 88, and all these years later, that's still, important. It resonates. It's because it was a good song then, it's a good song now. And a whole new generation of people understand that. And, that Joan Jett has I Hate Myself for Loving You. Then it was like a throwaway hit back then, but it evolves into a song that they use on Waiting All Week for Sunday Night Football. Like, you know what I mean? So there's something to some of those things. Again, people who are now in their 50s and 60s were in their teens and early 20s at that time. So they're the ones now spending the money. So naturally, big marketing companies are going to use something, use that nostalgia to help them, connect to whatever they're trying to sell at the time. But they're, Candle in the Wind was big. And then, about Marilyn Monroe, then he comes back again and, does the reference to Princess Diana. So there's some songs that, even though at the time they were important, there was, lasting effect on people, at least on the, the pop culture reference of it.
Oh yeah, definitely. What is that Rick Astley song? I think.
Oh, Never Gonna Give You Up. I love the Foo Fighters version. Like when the Foo Fighters bring him out on stage, that one, it's on YouTube somewhere. That's awesome because you would think the Foo Fighters, like, why would those guys, care? And the crowd loved it. And he's singing that song with Dave and the boys playing behind him. And
oh yeah, that's a song my son, my youngest son, my 10-year-old son would recognize because it's in, like, he used to do the dance. I forget what the video game is called. It was like Dance, Dance, Dance or something like that. And one of those things where you had to jump around, to the stuff on the screen. And that was one of the songs on it. Yeah. So the 80s it's really interesting. I think the 80s are remembered, and rightfully so. They're remembered as sort of this carefree, very fun era. And I think that still translates to today. My wife and I, there's a local nightclub in Tampa that has the first Friday of every month is an 80s night. And we always try to make it a point to make it to the 80s night if we can. And of course, the crowd, of course, skews heavily towards people our age, people that went to school in the 80s. But I'm always shocked by how many young kids I see there, and just not kids that just accidentally showed up on the wrong night. They didn't realize it was 80s night. I mean, they are there. They're into it. They're there. They're singing along with the songs. I'll tell you a funny story. This is a very popular night for this club. And so there'll be a line down the block people waiting to get in. And my wife and I are standing in line one night, and we get dressed up a little bit. I've got my long hair. I put on my vest with the stud things on it and everything. Maybe put a wristband or something on, try to look like a rocker a little bit. And so I'm standing in line, and there's a kid in front of me that they let kids in 18 and over into this club. And this kid it couldn't have been any more than 18. And he's got a Rat t-shirt on. And he turns around to me and my wife, and he says, "Oh, I love coming to the 80s night." He goes, I love 80s music so much. And I said, "Well, yeah, I was in high school in the 80s. I said, this is all the stuff I listened to." And I pointed at his shirt, like Rat. And he's like, "Oh my gosh, man, I so wish I could have been, in school. And can you just tell me what it was like, being in school in the 80s, and what was MTV like?" And the kid's like asking me all these questions like I'm the man from the moon or something,
Yep.
Like, what was it like, back then in the pioneer days, before the internet, we roughed it out, son. We had to walk all the way to the music store in the snow, uphill both ways if we wanted to buy our music.
Yep. And we had the timeout, exactly when the top 10 was going to come on the radio, so we could tape record a song from the radio because we didn't have that. We didn't go out and buy all that stuff. But no, it is when you think about it again, and any generation, the stuff that we take for granted. And then when you look back on it and there's probably a lot of times, just like when we were in school, that you would look back on the 60s as, oh man, it would have been cool to be around with the Beatles and Elvis and blah, blah, blah. And those kids now that like a guy like that probably think the same thing. And we didn't think it was a big deal, but when you look back on it, it was before the internet, before so many things that made everything a lot easier to access, right? It was, you had to work at what you were doing and kind of, you had your posters and you read the liner notes. There was more, I think there was more involvement. There was more hands on with the kind of music you were listening to, as opposed to now everything is kind of on a little screen somewhere and you save it to your phone. You have it forever. It's not on the shelves in your room, in little cases where you had all your little cassette tapes. It's just a different thing. And now in 80s, like you keep saying, and it's 100% true. It's either the poppy, like glam metal stuff. It's the Whitney Houstons and the pop stuff that way. But one band that I only got into much, much later had a really big album in the 80s, and that's the Pogues. And I didn't get into the Pogues until, a long time later. But, they have, I think it's If I Should Fall from Grace with God, which I think that song there sells cars now somewhere along the line of some commercial. But they took, Irish kind of folk songs and twisted it up with some punk and kind of did what they had to do and put the middle finger up to their establishments that they weren't happy with at this time. So, but again, we weren't really exposed to that kind of stuff where we grew up, where it was really the MTV generation and, what you heard on the radio, what you heard on KRZ, what your friends were listening to in the car when you're driving around the square, that kind of stuff. And, it was more, I think, the mainstream stuff that we had. And if you did listen to, if you're a Catholic schoolboy and you heard, you're listening to Motley Crue and Iron Maiden, we were real subversive. Like we were really breaking a lot of rules by doing that. And I wonder, like, when we hopefully talk in the future on some other episodes as well, is that kind of connection between like growing up and the emotions of the angst of your teenage years and the kind of music that you gravitate to. Like, it almost seems like the stuff that we were listening to is safe now compared to like maybe back then for our parents and stuff. It was, oh my God, that noise, like you said, when that guy was referencing jazz. But it's so weird how things like, even when you listen to the Sex Pistols now, they actually sound melodic. You know what I mean? Like they don't, at the time it was like, what's that crunchy noise? And now you hear stuff and it's like, is that like, there's no music there. It's just a thud. I just keep hearing a thud and like that's a song, we are now officially the old people, John, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
But we're going to go down in flames, man. We're not going to go down quietly.
I think that, and I've had this discussion with other people, and I am sort of fascinated by the sociological aspect of music and what draws certain people to certain styles of music. And because especially back when we were younger, it really was a part of your identity.
Mm-hmm.
it sort of reflected in some ways who you were. Nowadays, it's not quite the same because there's so much at kids' fingertips that a kid can be into Public Enemy just as they can be into Taylor Swift, and their playlists have everything on anything and everything. Whereas, like you mentioned, because we had limited access to stuff and we only had what we were exposed to via MTV or radio. And it also should be noted for people listening out there, we grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania in the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton area, which is a small town, and we did not have access to major concerts.
No.
Our Black Sabbath podcast that I do with my friend Darren, he's the same age as us, but he lived right outside of Philadelphia. So growing up, he was able to hop on a bus and go into the city and see all kinds of shows whenever he wanted to. And there was no way in heck my dad was going to drive me down to Philadelphia, 2 hours down to Philadelphia on a Wednesday night to see a band. It just wasn't going to happen. So I think in some ways that influenced us too, that we were kind of isolated where we were. We weren't getting we were getting our music via our older brothers and sisters or the radio or MTV. But I do think that there are certain things that, and I think it can be a bunch of different things. Like I was talking to a friend about this, and he was commenting on how, like, if you had older brothers or sisters, that could be very influential on the music that you listen to. I had an uncle that was my mom's brother who was only 9 years older than me. So he was like an older brother to me, and he would spend the summers with us and stuff like that. He lived in Allentown. We were in Mountaintop. So he wasn't that far from us, but I spent a lot of time around him. And when he was 18, I was 9. So when he was a teenager, I would go over his house, and he had Kiss and Cheap Trick and Ted Nugent and Aerosmith and stuff like that. That's what he was listening to. So I often wonder if I didn't have, let's say he was 20 years older than me, maybe I wouldn't have had that influence. Maybe that's what drove me down that sort of road of hard rock and heavy metal, is the influence of my uncle. Maybe it's the environment. I mentioned that when we were in school, Led Zeppelin and the Doors and Jimi Hendrix and a lot of that stuff was really popular. Rock 107, that was our local classic rock radio station. They played a lot of that kind of stuff. Like, that's where I heard Black Sabbath for the first time. That's where I heard a lot of stuff for the first time. So yeah, I think there's a lot of factors into it, and maybe there is. I'm sure somebody, a psychologist or somewhere, could also attribute certain personality traits to the type of music that. Well,
I think you're always
listen to.
When you're in your teens, you're always kind of, there's some form of rebellion, whether you're, you like the music that your parents don't like, or you hang out with the wrong crowd, or you go to that place on the other side of the track. There's always that, I'm going to push the boundaries a little bit. And I think that's probably something. There's probably studies, like you said, about that kind of thing, and what's the magnetic draw to the music that reflects that kind of rebellion. And what you just said about your cousin, your uncle, I just thought of it. I had somebody, a very similar situation. His name, my cousin Vito Nigro, who, this was probably 1979. I don't think I have the date right, but there was Pocono Jam. There was a concert here, and Ted Nugent was at it. And Vito was like 18, 19 years old, long curly hair. And he came in and he stayed with us for the weekend because he was going to the show. And I remember he was telling me all about, Nugent comes out on stage just wearing a loincloth, and it looks like he's, naked behind his guitar, and he's drawn pictures of like Kiss albums and stuff, the same kind of thing. Like, I'm like, who are these guys? Like, I'm listening to like, My Sharona and whatever's on, WILK and stuff like that. And you're telling me about all these crazy long haired, chaotic people screaming and yelling. And so, yeah, it kind of opens up that world of like, hey, what else is out there? And also it was kind of dangerous back then, right? We're young kids. And I remember the whole thing, like Ozzy was going to come and play at the CYC, and that was,
yeah.
And the bishop, put the kibosh on it and said, like, Ozzy's not playing there. And it was all that kind of stuff where it was dangerous. It was the stuff that your parents didn't want you to be involved in, and who's killing puppies on stage and biting heads off bats. And like so there was a whole lot of stuff going on where it was, and I think at the same time, like you said, we weren't going to see great big shows like you would in this, like New York City or Philly. Like we didn't have access. So when things did come around, that had a huge impact on us. Remember, there was a riot at the Kingston Armory, I think, with Blue Oyster Cult or something back in the day.
Yeah.
So and that was the only time you heard of something. Like those bands didn't come around all the time. So if something came around and it was controversial, it was all that was in the paper, right? And it was all that was on the 3 channels on the news that we got at that time. So it was definitely a much bigger impact on us. Like you said before, kids now can access anything at any time and any genre of music, any artist. And it's almost like we were in different tribes back then. Like if you listened to heavy metal in the 70s and early 80s, when the big British invasion came in, you wouldn't have been listening to, Kylie Minogue. You wouldn't be listening. You wouldn't be a New Kids on the Block guy if you were listening to Priest. But now that's okay. And so it was a different kind of world when it comes to that too.
Yeah. And I think you got to remember too that these bands that are making the music at that time are not that much older than we were. So we're 16 and the guys in Motley Crue are like 21, 22. So it's something that they feel like they're from the same world as you, and they're singing about things that you can relate to, that you can understand, just like the counterculture generation, Bob Dylan and stuff like that, singing about what was relevant to the youth of that time. And Bob Dylan, he was the same age as the people he was singing to back then. It's a little different now where kids will listen to music and they're listening to these classic bands. My oldest son really likes Nirvana and the Foo Fighters and stuff. And these guys are like practically my age, so it's a little bit different now, but I think again, that's just sort of the information age. Back then and again, everybody, you find things that you can relate to and that give you something. I mentioned early on in the show, 1988, it's our senior year. You're transitioning from being a kid to moving towards being a man, an adult. You're going to be going to college. You're going to be working towards a career and everything like that. So, the music will speak to you in some ways, depending on where your head is at. Everybody does this at least I think they do. I'll speak for myself. I do this. When I'm sad, I listen to sad music, and it ironically makes me feel better. When I was younger, I can't say I really have any angst left in me. I think that's all been dried up and gone away. But when you're a kid, you have a lot of angst. You have a lot of energy. You have a lot of, you're breaking up with your girlfriend and that kind of stuff. So that you're listening to music that sort of fits in with the soundtrack of your life at that.
Well, and that's what I really want to do on this podcast with you as a guest is talk about that exactly, the soundtrack of your life and how, we could look at different time periods and different effects it has on people, but there's no doubt about the emotional connectiveness between, your how you're feeling at the time, the passion you have at the time, and the music you're listening to. And then even when you are gone from that, you hear one song from, something that happened during this time when you got married or when someone passed away or, when you were graduating high school, it brings you right back to that time. And it's that, and one thing I want to eventually talk about, and I don't want to do it politically, I want to do it culturally, is the fact of, where this country stands right now. And I'm not going to say people's names and things like that, but and if people aren't paying attention, it's not going to get any better. But there is this gigantic shift between people who feel not listened to and those who they think are really in control. And then you have people who don't think they're in control or maybe don't think they're the establishment. They think they're still not the establishment, but yet they're being viewed by another group that they're being too, they're didactic and they're talking down to people. Again, it's unbelievable to me that a group of people that used to be labeled as the counter movement of the establishment is now the establishment, and people have gone to another tent to push back against, the power brokers, when it just, there's a huge culture shift in America. And I think the labels need to be pulled off, because it really has nothing to do with if it's a red or a blue or an R or a D. It's people feeling heard and others not listening to people. And music and passion ties into all that. And I think every every generation grows up and hopefully gets a little more smart, gets that wisdom. But yet it always seems like history repeats itself. And when the group behind them, when the 17 to 21-year-olds get fired up about something, the old heads are like, they're kids. They don't understand what they're talking about. But yet every huge momentum shift in American culture has always, the spark has always been fueled by the young people. You know what I mean? Whether it was the American Revolution, where the founding fathers were all in their early 20s, right? Or Vietnam, the pushback against that, and there's music that goes with that. There's a feeling that goes with that. And it's never based really on facts and reality and what should be good for you or what we should do. It's based on how you feel, and music ties into how you feel. And I just think, like, shame on us as a country that's been around 250 years that we still haven't figured out that is what moves people. It's emotion and passion, as opposed to graphs and charts and PowerPoints. And again, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I want to weave music into that, because I definitely think there's things we have to figure out, as the old people. Like, you and I are, if you think about, do you think, John, that when we were 18, we would care what 54-year-olds said? No. Like, I would be like, you guys should go to a home, like, shut up and go listen to Lawrence.
Yeah.
Well,
we were 18 looking at somebody who's 54.
Oh my God.
They were just
ancient.
Absolutely ancient. Because I don't want to scare you, but it subtracts. So 18 to 54, you're roughly 36 years. What's 1988 minus 36? So what is that? 1932?
Yeah.
Am I got that right?
Yeah.
1932?
Yep.
So that's the difference from 1988
yep.
to 1932 is the same as from 1988
to
2020. I may be off on that, but
that might have
the point.
It might as well have been like prehistoric. It might have been like the guy, it could have been, cavemen and dinosaurs. We wouldn't have paid attention to anybody from 32. No, 100%. And that's what it's hysterical that we're probably repeating all the same things and all the same cliches that our parents and grandparents did, just using different words and different connection, because things change. But, you forget that all the dreams and hopes and everything, like here's, romantic, idealistic Vito going off. But all those things that start your career and start your, why you start a family or why you move to a certain place in the country, it's all based on dreams and passion and energy and emotion, right? And then when you get calm and you start to get some money in the bank and you start to get conservative in your ideals on stuff, you forget all that stuff. And it's almost like I wish you could crack that hard shell on the outside of being an adult and go back and just remember for a moment what that was like when you're, between 14 and 19 or 15 and 21, and because that's what fuels all that kind of music movement. Right. And I think
go ahead. I was going to tell you something interesting that sort of ties in to this. And I think some of the stuff you were talking about earlier, I think as a society, we're grappling with this sort of information age.
Yep.
And I think music is dealing with that too, where there's just so much and it can feel so overwhelming. And maybe it's because I wasn't raised on this. Maybe kids that were raised during the internet age and forward will be able to process all this better than, I'll speak for myself, I do. But I was I lived in Falls Church, Virginia for 3 years. To 3 years before I got married. My wife at the time she wasn't my wife yet, but she was in medical school at the time. I was waiting for her to finish medical school. So she was in Philadelphia. I was in Falls Church, Virginia. So anyways, we visited Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. And I said, I want to go out to Falls Church and I want to drive by that house I used to live in. I used to live in a house with a bunch of different people. And I just stood outside this house for a little, this tiny little house. And I stood at, nobody's living in it currently, so it didn't seem like I was a stalker standing outside.
Who's this guy staring at our house?
Yeah, the house was vacant. And I sat there and I said to myself, 1994, I didn't have a television from 1989 till I got married in 1996. So when I was living in that house, I had no TV. The internet didn't even exist yet. I had no cell phone. And I lived and I thought to myself, what in the world did I do with myself back then? Well, I worked. I taught 4 days a week at a school in inner city Washington, D.C. I used to go outside and run. I was an avid runner at that time. I used to listen to a lot of music. I used to read a lot. I used to like to go to Tower Records and in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, and just roam around and read magazines and look at the CDs. And I would buy a CD every now and then, because I just got my paycheck, and I always put a little money aside to go and buy a couple CDs. And I just lived a much simpler life back then. And seeing that house really reminded me of that. And with all the noise and racket that is going on in the world and the internet and social media and stuff like that, I've been disconnecting myself I've deactivated my Facebook page. I'm going to step away from Facebook for a couple months. I've been just sort of stepping away from all this stuff and going back to a little bit of a simpler time. I've been listening to more music, just sitting down and just listening to music, not doing anything else, just putting on a record, sitting there listening, playing my bass and playing piano and going out for walks, and just sort of, I feel like I'm decompressing in a lot of ways. And there's something to be said about that for anybody out there who's listening, who's maybe younger and never even grew up during that time. And if you're older like we are, you can remember that time back to before the internet and social media and all this stuff. And there's something to be said about that. Doesn't mean you have to go and live out in the woods, is what do they call it, off grid. Yeah. Doesn't mean you have to move to Alaska and go off grid. But I think there is a way to find a healthier balance in life. And I'm currently trying to do that. And when you mention music, I find that that's something that I'm rediscovering, sort of this passion, because I'm not distracted by all these other things. My life back then was real simple. I taught at my school. I played my guitar. I jogged. That was about it. I talked to my girlfriend, hung out with my girlfriend. That was about it. Played in my band. You know what I mean? It was just sort of a lot simpler back then. But I think that, there's something to be said about that. And I'm trying to rediscover that in some way.
Well, and the thing about, music and, how it influences how you feel, or how you feel influences how you interpret or how you listen to music, or what you choose to listen to. When you think about it, and you as a musician know all the specifics way better than I could articulate this, but there's only X amount of notes, right? There's only so many things out there. There's only so many sounds that are out there, that have always been out there, that anyone who's ever played any type of musical instrument or tried to have any kind of rhythm, there's only so many things you could do. And what I'm leading to is like, when you sit down, and we didn't do this, I don't think, maybe you did, it being a musician, but I especially in high school, I never really paid attention to classical music. But if you listen to something, that hundreds and hundreds of years old, and the power, if you just sit and listen to almost, the lack of a better word, the majesty and the power behind some of those pieces, and you're thinking, man, like the people who are creating that were also going through things, whatever they were, and were feeling a certain way when they created those, pieces, whether, it's not a 3-minute rock and roll song, different kind of thing. But, and that's almost like this truth that it's going to go with us no matter where we are, whether we have the internet or whatever the heck the internet or the social media is going to look like 50 years from now. But the sounds that are out there that we can hear and that we could put together in certain ways that make people feel certain things, like that's awesome. I don't know how to explain that, but that's what I want to get to when we talk about different things, and we can kind of maybe put little buckets out there and like, all right, we're going to talk about how music worked in this fashion or this theme, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, that's what you're talking about is that you could be simple. You could kind of limit the noise that's in your world. But even by doing that, when you open yourself up to certain thing, whether it's what you read or what you listen to, there's a lot of power there, and it could almost like the simplification could open you up to so many more things, gives you more clarity, I think, and what you could process through stuff like you're saying. There's so much noise out there right now. I think we all need time to process, and music also heals, right? Like when you said, when you feel sad, you listen to sad songs to make you feel better. And, I just think right now, for America, for this country and the society we're in right now, to kind of move on in a positive way, I think there needs to be a lot of healing and a lot of maybe introspective just work done, and I'm not a therapist or I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express to say I'm smarter than anybody, but I think music helps that, right? Music definitely, it what does it say? It soothes the savage beast. So I think it could help whatever we're going through. And again, people are probably going to be like, I'm not listening to that podcast now. Those two old men are talking about weird stuff, but we will talk about ACDC. We will talk about how Highway to Hell still sounds really cool today, even though it's a million years old. Yeah. But what I'm saying? Like, you could probably articulate it because you're a musician and you know how to make those sounds. You could take a cello and make people cry, or you could, play a guitar and make people's, faces melt. You get it. There's a lot of power there.
Yeah. And I think good art is something that makes you feel something. It can make you feel happy. It can make you feel sad. It can make you feel angry. Bad art just doesn't do anything. Mm-hmm. It's like a bad movie. A bad movie just doesn't do anything. You just forget about it. It just has no impact on you. And so I think good music, there's something about it that can trigger emotions. That's what it can sort of touch your soul in some ways. And it does it in a way that, I mean, there are certain sort of formulas and stuff that people use, but I think at the end of the day, people can sense genuine expression. I think about John Lennon, the song Jealous Guy. Now that seems real. You listen to the way he sings that song and it seems genuine. It doesn't sound contrived. And because it seems so real and it seems so raw, it's almost like he's sort of opening himself up like that. You can relate to it and you can put yourself into it. And music has a way to, art in general, it has a way that it can be very in the moment. It can ground you in the moment. It's almost Zen-like. It's when something can grab you. Think about a really good movie. Have you walked into a movie theater and 2.5 hours later it's over and you went, oh my gosh, like that. It just feels like it went by in the blink of an eye because you were so on the edge of your seat or you were so engaged in what was happening. You were there. You were nowhere else. You were in that movie theater, or if you're at a concert and you're just totally there in the moment. There's something to be said about that, especially in this day and age where, as we've alluded to a bunch of times, there's so many distractions. I understand the appeal of like certain types of modern dance music, like electronic music and stuff like that. People go out and it almost becomes like a trance that they're in. They go and they're just there in that moment, almost like one with the music. And like you said, then it does sort of touch your soul and it becomes something that you kind of carry with you. It's like a memory or something that's just sort of something that you bring with you. We all have music that we associate with certain times in our life, certain people in our life, certain happy moments, certain sad moments. I think on our first Lost in the Ether podcast that we did, I mentioned that one of the schools I taught at, we had a team builder, and it was a small staff, maybe like 15 people. And we did a team builder, and every month another person was responsible for setting up what we were going to do for the team builder exercise. And when it was my turn, I asked everyone to write down 2 songs that had some meaning to them and then to share them with the group. And the point of the team builder is just for everyone to, get to know each other, that kind of thing. And it was amazing. I don't think everybody at one point or another had a tear in their eye because we went around the circle and everybody shared their songs. Almost everybody had something that reminded them of a lost love, a forgot, a parent, a deceased parent, or some happy time in their life. So yeah, music is very art in general, I think, is very powerful like that. It can transport you to the past. It can ground you in the present, and it does it in a way that's in a lot of, you can analyze it, but it's still sort of unexplainable. I mean, how do you define what moves the heart? How do you define what love is? You know what I mean? These are all things that
Like
you can sort of put words to it, but you can't really.
No, it's like great
Only a
poetry.
feeling.
Yeah, if it moves you, it's successful, and it could move you differently than moves me. And so you really can't define it, or you can't define why it moves you in that direction. It just does because of whatever, because of the color you see, or the sound, or the whatever you bring with it. Like how you relate to it is where the emotion comes from. Now, and the thing about music, which is to me really interesting, because you reference like the kind of mood you're in when you're listening to it. Like there's times where I love garage rocky kind of imperfect stuff. It just sounds like you could tell they're offbeat, and they're playing literally in a garage somewhere and somebody fell off a stool. But it's cool because that's what it's supposed to sound like. And other times, and I'm not really a big like auto tune kind of guy, but there's other things that music could almost sound perfect because it's so right, whether it's electronic or somebody just, a drummer that has a incredible, timing that it's just perfect. You could set a clock to it, and it's okay. It could be both things, right? It could be something that sounds completely genuine and almost like someone singing it through tears themselves, or it could be something that sounds like, it's, AI and a voice that came out of a computer is the sound behind it. So it's everything all at once, right? It's whatever you want it to be at the time. And one of I do remember that conversation that you brought that up in the Lost Weekend podcast that we have. And a thing that I used in teaching and made me just remember it is I taught a group of kids, and we covered Catcher in the Rye, the novel. It was never made into a movie. And one of the things that I used to see if they, read and understood, rather than having them write a paper on it, I had them create a soundtrack to it. So it was never a movie, but I said, look, we're going to make it into a movie. And you're going to, I want you to come up with 3 scenes from the novel and put a song to it and explain why you chose that song for that part of the book. And that told me enough about whether or not they got what was going on and how they connected to, what they understood and stuff. So you can use music for a million. You could use it to heal yourself. You could use it to educate people or be educated, by what comes back at you. And what I'd like to do, and I'm going to make sure I save this episode better this time, but I would like, when we revisit this, I want to focus on soundtracks. Like I'll talk to you off air about it, how we could map it out, but definitely how maybe some movies chose certain songs to move the movie forward or however it is. But I think there's some really cool things that we could talk about, because movies come and go, and there's, like you said, a bad movie, and it doesn't matter what songs are in it. If the movie wasn't very good, you're not going to remember the soundtrack. But sometimes when you have a great movie with a great soundtrack, it's around forever, and it's just part of your social consciousness. So I want to talk about some of that kind of stuff, in the future.
Absolutely.
I'm going to put you on the spot. So in 1988, if you had to pick one song from 1988 that you would say is your favorite song or album, if you want to go album wise, but a song from 88, what would it be? And don't think forever, and don't give me 10 answers. One song from 88. What do you think?
Boy, I'd have to.
Just
Guns N' Roses.
Okay.
Patience.
Patience?
That's certainly a huge. Yeah. When I think about that and that album, the way they played the acoustic, there were a bunch of acoustic songs on it, and so.
You go with Patience.
That came out in '88. I'm gonna go with that.
And I'm gonna say Cult of Personality from Living Colour.
That's
when I heard that
album.
It there's 4 black guys playing metal, and it gets Vernon Reid playing like I never heard anyone play before, and just the soaring lyrics and what the lyrics are about, and the little intro and outro. I just thought that song at that time just kind of hit, you know what I mean? And it's almost yeah, like a one-hit wonder. Like they didn't really do much after that. I think Corey Glover, I think he was in Platoon. He was in the movie Platoon. He had a small part in that. And those guys really never, had that kind of success again. But that song at that time, I think if I thought of 1988, that would be one of the ones I would say. And then, you look at U2 and, Desire and blah, blah, blah. But, because I don't know that song, if you took that out of the 80s, it would definitely, there'd be a hole there, because it was something different.
That's an interesting song too, because it's sort of, as we talked about earlier, it's the tides were starting to change. And to me, that's a song that is sort of pushing more towards the 90s, and that it was sort of political and socially conscious. Living Colour was a socially conscious band, and it was sort of moving music out of the let's just rock and roll all night and party every day to, hey, there's some real issues out here in the world and we need to pay attention to them. So yeah, that's a great pick.
Yeah, and I didn't really think. I was just looking. I turned real quick and I saw it on the list, and I just pointed out because you can hear that guitar riff all the time. Like that's boom. You hear that and you know what's going on. But no, but I know in 1988 I saw Aerosmith and Guns N' Roses at Pocono Downs, and Guns N' Roses played Patience, and I don't think at that time I don't know when GNR Lies came out, but I know
88.
But it was
November of 88.
Okay, yeah. So if they did play Patience there, it would have been before the album came out, and it was definitely something that people are like, what's this? This isn't, Welcome to the Jungle kind of stuff. So it was a move in a different direction for them. But, they were kind of following suit with other bands kind of being softer, at that time. Well, listen, I do appreciate you giving us the time. I've gone over what I wanted to because we could talk all day about music, but we will come back again. This will be on. I will get this out as soon as possible so it doesn't get lost in the stratosphere again. And we will come back and talk about some movie soundtracks and so the ones that kind of stick and the ones maybe that are, or were good at the time, but we don't, like we could talk about Raindrops Are Falling on Your Head from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or we could talk about Top Gun, or we could talk about, some crazy zombie movies, but there's some cool stuff out there. Not to mention, the master himself, Quentin Tarantino, and how he puts, songs and things that really help the scene move forward. So there's a lot to go there. And I'm going to lean heavily on you because, again, my friend, I'm the babbling expert and you are the musical expert. So it will work well together.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to it, and thank you so much.
Well, and tell everybody who's listening again, what are the platforms, the podcasts and the channel that we can find you at? Tell them again.
Sure. The podcasts are on all the podcast networks, streaming wherever you stream a podcast. You can find Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast, or Kicked in the Teeth, an ACDC podcast. And if you go to YouTube and type in Lair, Lair, of The Alchemist, you'll find my YouTube channel. So thanks again to you, Vito, and to everybody out there for listening. I look forward to talking more music with you and everybody out there.
Yeah, awesome. And our guest has been John Gaffney, a musician extraordinaire and an expert in so many ways, a really good friend, a good man. And we want to thank him for coming on. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. Stay tuned